All right. Good evening and good morning. For me, it's morning. To today's webinar. This is Land Your Dream Job, Land Your Software Dream Job in Silicon Valley and elsewhere. And we're going to talk about a few different companies and processes and how they work and how they hire. Good. Let me introduce myself first. My name is Ramon Lopez. I've been a software developer, an engineering manager at a few different companies. I've been in the industry for a number of years now. Some of you may know me from from the YouTube channel Success in Tech, where you can find a lot of my videos about system design and just growing as an engineer and as a professional in the software industry. So check it out if you haven't. And let's get started with today's topic. This is about interview preparation. Interview preparation for a software engineering job, for a development job, is, I wouldn't say extraordinarily difficult, but it definitely requires preparation. So can I just wing it? No, usually not. Of course, it depends on your situation and the role you're applying for and the company you're applying for. And the process that I will describe today and my recommendation how to prepare for it is not universal. So I'm not preparing you specifically for a company, but I'm taking all the experience that I have from interviewing with many companies across Europe and North America. And I try to combine and I'll try to give you guys a comprehensive insight into the process and the best preparation. So again, it depends on the company. Not every process will follow. Not every hiring process will follow this schema here. And what I'll tell you today is just from my own experience. So what is this process? We're talking about 3 stages in general, which are, and the 3 stages begin with the CV phase, where you will send in your CV, you will hopefully get selected by the recruiters. Then you'll get into a second stage, which is the phone interview or online challenge stage, which is really mainly there to filter out a number of candidates to a manageable number, and then you'll end in a on-site interview loop where you'll have a number of in-person interviews to go through, and sometimes those on-site interviews will be mixed in with some actual pair programming or maybe some homework that you'll bring to the on-site interviews. So this stage differs quite a bit from company to company, and we'll cover all 3 stages in more detail now. So let's talk about the CV first. Your CV has to be short and concise. You want to pack in a lot of information, so high information density, and usually the recommendation is to have 1 page per 10 years of experience. That means many of us will have 1 page, not 1.5 pages, not 1.2 pages, just really 1 page, and you try to put your most compelling properties, so the things that you want to be hired for, towards the top of your CV. So if your most compelling feature, so to say, is a lot of industry experience or very impressive industry experience, you put that section at the top of the CV. If maybe you're coming straight from university and you've been working on very interesting projects, very challenging projects, you may want to put this section on the top of your CV, right? What I recommend is to follow a certain schema when it comes to describing your previous experience, projects, job experience, and so on. And we'll encounter this schema one more time in this webinar. The schema is situation, action, result. So you want to explain what your situation was at a certain company, what the challenge was that you were faced with, what action you took, so design, implementation, coordination with others, whatever it was, and what the result was. And the result has to be as much as possible quantifiable, some data points, some metrics that show that your work changed something to the better in this team or in this company. I would also recommend that you have a look at careercup.com. I'm not affiliated with this page or anything, but I think they have a very good template for a CV, not only structure of the document wise, but also content wise. So the content of this CV that you'll see there is quite interesting. It follows this situation, action, result schema, and it's very concise. Of course, what always helps in terms of sending in your CV is referrals. HR and recruiters, they take maybe a minute or so to read your CV, and especially if it's a CV that comes in through an online form, they potentially take even less time to read through it. On the other hand, when CVs come in through referrals, so through current employees, then chances are better that you are at least invited to the to the phone interview or online challenge stage, right? Employees are oftentimes incentivized to make referrals, so it shouldn't be too hard for you guys to find somebody who can take your CV and hand it in for you at this company. That's always a plus if you have any contacts in those companies. If you know a few people, then just ask. That's all you can do, and it makes a big difference. So let's talk about the second stage: phone interviews and online challenges. This stage is mainly there to filter out candidates and answer the question: is it worth to bring the candidate on site? You can imagine that it's expensive, and it takes a lot of time for companies to bring a lot of candidates on site, to run through multiple interviews with each of those candidates, and that's why you want to bring candidates on site who have a very high chance of succeeding, right? In general, I would always recommend to think about the interview situation or the interview process from the perspective of that company or of that interviewer. In many cases, it will help you to understand why certain decisions are made or why the processes are set up in a way. And during the interview, it will help you understand what the interviewer is looking for. So perspective change is the key word here. So phone interviews, they're going to be, it could be 1 or 2 phone interviews you go through, or maybe 1 phone interview and 1 online challenge. What you will face there is 2 situations. If it's with the recruiter, they will ask you about your background. They will mostly assess if you are applying for the right role, right? So they would ask you, about background experience, about education, about the things you're passionate about, and they would try to assess that first. Sometimes they would also ask you a few basic questions. I call it your tech fundamentals. So object-oriented principles, runtimes, nothing interactive, like just a few questions. Now, when it comes to the second phone interview, usually those are with engineers. So especially, I'm going to assume in many cases today that you will be applying for a software developer role or software engineering role. This second phone interview will be with an engineer, and it's usually coding or a very technical interview. So in many cases, you will have a shared editor, something like a Google Doc, that you are working on with your interviewer on the phone, and the interviewer will ask you questions, coding questions, maybe simple design questions, and you will work on that document, getting feedback from the interviewer. maybe diving into a few questions in more detail and so on. For me, I've always said that the coding phone interview is the hardest part, because you're missing a lot of things from in-person interviews. So mimics and gestures you're missing in a phone interview. You can't really read your interviewer, right? In an in-person situation, a lot of times you can not only ask clarifying questions, but also look at the reaction of the interviewer while you draw something on a whiteboard. And that will give you certain hints. And communication in person is just easier because there is no technology in between us, right? So in phone interviews, oftentimes you may have a bad connection, you may have bad, lags or latency. Of course, language barriers are even worse when it's on the phone. So this is why you can't mitigate this problem, but you can prepare for it, right? So that's why I recommend that you practice this stage very specifically with, for example, websites like pramp.com. And again, I'm not affiliated with those guys, but I've used it myself a few years ago, and I thought it's a very neat idea. Essentially, it will pair you up with somebody else, random people, strangers, to practice coding interviews online. And you will very effectively mock interviews with other people, and it helps you to get comfortable and familiar with the situation. Getting connected with a stranger, talking through coding problems, and you will face the exact same issues, right? So you could have audio issues, connection issues, lags, latency, but it will help you get more comfortable. And once you are comfortable in this situation, the interview situation will not be as scary, and you can actually perform as well as you would like to in that interview. Cool. On-sites. So the second round, or the third round, sorry, would be on-sites, and how on-sites are designed, how this process is designed. Again, it depends on your situation and on the company, but you can expect a few in-person interviews, and you can expect maybe some pair programming with an engineer. Maybe you will have received some homework before, and you'll prepare certain coding problems beforehand and bring them to an on-site stage. The very classical on-site loop, so to say, is 4 or 5 interviews with a mix of engineers and maybe the hiring manager, maybe product managers or applied scientists. I would say if you're applying for a junior engineering position, a junior developer position, it's mostly going to be engineers. But if you're a more senior engineer, maybe an engineering manager, maybe something like a solution architect, or maybe a technical project manager, it will be more of a mix between roles. All of them will potentially be on a whiteboard, and we'll talk about the content of each, or the possible content of each interview in a second. But just in general, again, it's not natural to code on a whiteboard, similar to how it's not natural to code and explain things over the phone. So again, you want to be prepared for this situation, specifically how to code on a whiteboard. And it's really important to be comfortable in this situation. You can only be comfortable in situation by going through this many times and get familiar with the writing and deleting and space management, so to say, on the whiteboard, all these things. So what are the topics in these on-site interviews, or even in the phone interviews? Mostly 3 topics, and these are the 3 topics that we are gonna dive deep today. We'll have coding, we'll have system design, and we'll have behavioral questions. And you'll encounter a mix of those three in every interview, or in most interviews, I would say. And let's dive right into it. Coding interviews or algorithm interviews are the classic, so to say. I think when I talk to people preparation-wise, this is where they spend the most time preparing for coding interviews. I also think if you look at the resources out there, websites out there, books written, this is where you'll find very good content. You'll also find a lot of garbage content, to be honest, but we'll talk about resources in a second. I'm not saying it's a bad thing that people prepare for this part the most, but I just want to point out that it's not the only part you should be preparing for. So it's important, but it's not the only topic. So coding interviews in general, they start off easy, and they start off with an interview with a coding question that has a naive solution in the most cases. And they are usually, that problem or that solution can usually be optimized, and therefore it becomes harder, and maybe you may not be able to finish that optimized solution during the interview. In general, like many of those interview questions, if you feel comfortable and you can talk through the interview problem with your interviewer, the whole interview should feel more like a discussion with colleagues and not this weird, awkward exam situation. The advice that I give is always to over communicate instead of just being silent and just standing there and thinking about the problem for 10 minutes, meaning talk out loud, right? So it starts off with clarifying questions. It then goes into a solution finding mode and then a coding mode. So during all those sections of this interview, you want to speak out loud. You want to let the interviewer participate in your thinking and your solution finding. And this has two reasons. One reason is the interviewer needs to understand how you approach the problem. And that's the biggest part that they will assess, is how you can approach the problem and how you can find a solution for something you don't know, right? That's the whole point of it. So it doesn't make a lot of sense if they give you an interview problem and you've done it before and you just memorized whatever solution and put it on a whiteboard. That's, maybe it will work out for you, but from an interviewing perspective, that's exactly what they not want, right? They want you to be challenged with something that you haven't seen before, and they want to assess how well you can cope with that situation and how you can find a solution. And also interesting, in many cases, it's not the most important part how perfect your solution is. You should have a good solution, of course, but I think the bigger focus is on how you approach the problem and how you find the solution, and maybe how you go from a not really working but okay solution to something more solid. That is why I think over communication is super important. And yeah, let's talk about what exactly will be the content of this. So you'll talk about the question first. You'll ask more of those clarifying questions to narrow down the scope of the question. That could be data types, input and output. It could be about just non-functional requirements, so to say. Maybe you want to ask about the scope of the question. So you'll just try to narrow down those potential edge cases. It's important to know that those questions are sometimes vague by design. So they want you to come up with those clarifying questions. And then again, you speak out loud, you talk through your solution that you are have in your mind and that you develop in your mind, and then you talk while you're coding, right? So you'll put once you describe the approach that you're taking, you describe the algorithm before you actually code, and then you go to the whiteboard and start coding it. And at any stage, you will get feedback from the interviewer, right? So I mentioned there's two reasons for this over communication. The first one is they want to assess your problem solving skills. The second one is you can actually get more feedback if you are more vocal, right? So if you're standing there for 10 minutes not saying anything, they can't help you, right? But if you just speak out loud and explain where you are stuck, or explain where you see the biggest challenge with this interview question, then they can give you feedback. And usually interviewers are interested to give you feedback because they want to see you progress, right? They want to see you make progress on the question, so they can assess more of your of you being an engineer and you solving problems. So when you're stuck, there's no point in trying for 20 minutes and coming up with something which doesn't lead anywhere. I would go for it and ask for hints if you're just really stuck, because you want to make the best out of this time, and you have maybe 45 minutes in such an interview to come up with a solid solution. Cool. So how do we practice coding in algorithms, right? So of course it makes sense to go through a lot of challenges, maybe hackathons, and you guys know HackerEarth, and it's a great resource. You want to get a lot of practice in, just because, again, you will feel more comfortable in that situation. You will be faster. You will recognize certain patterns, and it's just going to make the process smoother for you. In general, I would also recommend a few books and a few other resources. So when it comes to books, there is a very fundamental book which many of you may know. It's called Introduction to Algorithms by Corman, and it's covering so much ground. It's covering a lot of those interview questions, or a lot of those topics that come up in interview questions, and they go very deep in explaining how you arrive from a problem statement to a solution. In many cases, it's too detailed for an interview question, but this is a foundational computer science book, and even though you may not need all that detail for an interview question, it's just good to know and a good basis for every engineer. And sometimes we get too hung up in interview preparation, and we only look at interview preparation, but what you actually want is to grow as an engineer, grow as a software engineer. And that's where you should put your time, because once you're through the interview, that's going to be your job, right? So you want to be good at software engineering in general. Another book that is very focused on the interviewing process and coding mainly is this book called Cracking the Coding Interview. Again, many of you may know this already. Very good resource, very in-depth, with a lot of sample questions and well explained solutions. I give group and one-on-one courses on my website, successintech.com, and I've been going through this kind of preparation with people for a long time now. What I would also recommend is offline practice. So offline practice with friends or colleagues, where you meet maybe once a week or something like this, and you practice and you mock interview each other on a whiteboard or with pen and paper. If you have colleagues you can do that with, that's great. If not, you can still do offline practice on pen and paper yourself. And I definitely recommend this because, again, you are not used to writing code on a Google Doc or on a whiteboard. and you won't have IDE support, you won't have highlighting or auto completion, it will feel very differently, and you need to be, I would say, more precise, right? So you need to write lines of code without all the time deleting and jumping from place A to place B. So it takes a while to practice that. Cool. Let's go ahead. The next big topic is system design. System design is a very broad topic, right? So we went from coding, which is usually a very specific question, and there are a handful of correct solutions, I'll call them. And system design now is designing big, sometimes big, even scaled, cloud native systems which contain thousands of those little algorithms that you just implemented in a coding question. So by definition, they are vague and they're ambiguous, and there is no single right answer, right? The more senior you get, the more important system design questions will be. You will face a mix of coding and system design questions in every interview loop, I would assume. But again, the more senior you get, and even if you go into more of an engineering management role or a technical, something like a solution architect role, system design is very crucial. What I've experienced is that interviewers with system design will give you the lead, and they just want to see you, where you take that question and how you handle it. And this can be a blessing and a curse at the same time. If you are, cool with the situation, if you're comfortable with it, if you are comfortable talking about system design, it's great to have the lead and just go with that question and, talk about many different topics. But if you're insecure and you're not super comfortable talking about system design and those concepts and components, then it can be a little bit frustrating because you're not getting a lot of feedback from them in many cases, right? So how do you approach a system design question? On a high level, it's kind of similar to a coding question. You want to disambiguate, and therefore you want to ask clarifying questions. But that's mostly where the similarities end, because now you will still have a very broad problem, and if the problem of the question is something like design YouTube or design Instagram, it's still just a lot of ground to cover. This is where my recommendation comes in to identify 2 to 3 core features. And usually this is enough, right? Because of course, a system, let's take the Instagram example, it contains a ton of topics, but many of those topics will be shared between every bigger system. So they will be shared between, when it comes to, let's say, logging or user authentication or, signing up users, access management, let's say even front-end design, front-end development work. So there is a ton of topics, and they will be kind of the same for every bigger web application out there or web service. And you want to identify those core features, right? So let's stick with the Instagram example. The Instagram is a service that allows you to excuse me. It's a service that allows you to upload photos, look at a timeline, and then interact with those photos. So the key features we could pick are something like uploading content, generating a timeline, and having a follower system which allows you to, as I said, interact with content. So once you have those key features, it will help you to have a structure in your interview problem. And sometimes it makes sense to start with guesstimations, so estimating certain aspects of the system. Maybe they'll give you a starting point. They will say you will have 1 million users, and then you can go from there. You can guesstimate how much traffic you will have to handle, what could be your peak time traffic. Then you maybe go into estimating read and write distribution of systems, maybe your databases, and you can make some good progress there. Just putting a few numbers on the table. This is not going to be precise, right? Because you're just making up things, but you should at least try. Also, don't think that you have to design the whole system, right? So again, if it's design Instagram and it's a 50-minute interview, first of all, nobody knows how Instagram is really designed, probably not even most Instagram developers, and you just don't have the time to touch every aspect of the system. When you structure your solution, so when you come up with your solution on a whiteboard, maybe even before coming to the whiteboard, and while you're explaining your approach, it makes sense, at least for me and to a lot of people, that you visualize the request pattern, so to say. So you explain to your interviewer that, okay, let's start with a get request, get timeline, let's say, and you're on your phone, and and this request travels to let's say a load balancer and some application servers, and then maybe you'll have some sort of a microservice architecture or something like this, then to a storage layer, and in between, at some points you will talk about maybe caching or some pre-computation at some point as well. But while you explain this, you go from a defined starting point to a defined endpoint, which is in many cases the storage layer, right? So it helps you to have this structure, and it helps the interviewer to follow your train of thought. And again, that's what you want, right? You want the interviewer to be able to assess your approach and your train of thought. Once you explained this, you want to draw things on the whiteboard, and you want to draw the bigger components, right? And I mentioned before, I have this YouTube channel, so if you want to see this in action, so to say, go to Success in Tech on YouTube and check out the whiteboarding there. What I usually do is I start on a high level and I draw a few bigger components on the whiteboard. And I would say, okay, this component is responsible for a certain functionality, and that component is responsible for other functionality. And I define how they communicate with each other, right? So you'll get into a little bit of API design at this point. And all at the same time, you have your key features maybe on the right side of the whiteboard. So you can always make those call outs that, okay, this component will support this key feature and that component will support that key feature. So you don't lose it. You don't lose it in while you're going too deep, right? So you start on this high level, and then you pick one of those components, which is maybe a service, right? And you dive into that one service, and you define the APIs, you define how it works inside. You define, maybe things like replication, maybe things like state, just some very fundamental concepts. And we don't have the time to go over such concepts today, but what I often say is that you need to understand the basic concepts in system design rather than specific technologies, right? So let me give you an example here. We'll talk about statelessness, right? What is stateless? It's a lot more important to understand what it means in terms of a system and how it affects things like replication and how it affects your overall design, than being able to say, I will use Nginx as my load balancer. right? So those are two things. Of course, it's good if you can talk about certain technologies and you can show that you have experience with them. But if you're not making conscious decisions about the design and about the system choices you make, I would seriously question, why you're making those decisions, right? So it's important to know the concept. It's less important to know the technologies, and it's very important that you have clear reasoning. So when you design your system, you want to explain why you are making choices, why you are using let's say, a NoSQL key value store at this point and not a Oracle database or traditional relational database. You want to explain why you're using a caching layer at this point and why you're using let's say, a highly consistent database at a different point. Okay, and in many cases, the reasons are, that this is a bottleneck, or that, the reason could be this is a read storage that is very crucial to my system, and I want to be able to always at least read certain aspects. So again, let's stick with the Instagram example. I always want to allow people to look at their timelines. I can live with the fact that maybe sometimes they're not able to upload, right? So, but then you will have a copy or a replica of your timelines that you generated in storage that is very fast and is replicated across the world, and it means that you're giving up some consistency, but you'll have high availability, right, for this piece of your system. And this is a whole other topic, the so-called cap theorem. And it's just, again, one of those concepts where it affects your whole design, it affects your whole system. Another one that comes up in many cases is pre-computation. So what can you pre-compute before the users access it? Another one that I can think of right now is queuing, right? So in which situation you would use and employ queuing systems, right? Again, clear reasoning is super important. It's not enough if you just say, I'm going to use a queue or I'm going to use a cache here. The question will always be, okay, why? What's the trade-off? What's the optimization you're making? What's the bottleneck maybe that you're trying to solve here? Cool. How do we practice system design? Again, online reading brings you quite far. I recommend highscalability.com. It's a website that talks a lot about real systems, real world systems, and they go deep into which technologies they use and the scale of everything. And this may not be super relevant for an interview situation, but first of all, it's just very, very interesting, to hear and read about big scaled systems and how they solve certain challenges. And it gives you an idea of which technologies are used. And from there, what I always like to do is take a look at one of those blog entries on highscalability.com, and I read about a few technologies and I haven't heard of them before, and I take those and I'll look it up. I'll just read about the properties of this technology, and I start to understand, okay, this is why they're using this. This has certain advantages, and I can compare with other technologies they use. And yeah, it's just interesting, and it gives you a good insight. And in some cases, it may fill a gap that you have, if you don't have a lot of system design knowledge or experience, right? So you can at least read about how other companies do it. Engineering blogs, there are a few good engineering blogs out there. There's an Uber blog, an Airbnb blog. I think there's a LinkedIn engineering blog as well. So tons of those resources, and they put those blogs out there to give interested people, again, insights into the company, it's also a bit of a hiring tool for them, right? Because if people read that, let's say, Airbnb uses interesting technology and builds interesting stuff, people will apply for those companies. But yeah, nonetheless, good information, good data source. When it comes to books, the first one here is a very fundamental book that many people will maybe encounter in university. It's called Computer Networks by Andrew Tannenbaum. It explains the fundamentals of networking, right? And this is something that you will encounter in system design again and again, not in a lot of detail, but it's just good knowledge to have as an engineer and sometimes to refresh it. Another one I have here is the site reliability book, the SRE book that different people at Google wrote. I think it's very, very fascinating, very interesting. It's almost like a few different case studies of how they solve operations at Google. And again, it gives you very good insights. And yeah, the courses that I do on my website are covering coding and system design both. Cool, last topic. Let me do a quick time check. Yeah, so we'll have 2 more slides or something like this, and then we'll go into Q&A. So behavioral questions, they can appear in every interview stage, right? So they will appear in phone interviews with recruiters, sometimes with engineers as well, and definitely in on-site interviews. They are, in many cases, crucial to your success. And this, you know, maybe you've heard this before, but I'm really serious about this, because put yourself into the shoes of an interviewer, and you know, maybe not even the owner of the company, but just, you know, you are the interviewer, you are in the team that is hiring for, or there is right now hiring. Then behavioral questions tell you a lot about that person, and you want to make sure that the person that joins your team is a good fit, right? So technical knowledge, technical experience is a big part, but the personal part and the behavioral part is equally important, in my opinion. And so in many cases, I have seen people with strong tech backgrounds not being hired because you know, just this behavioral personal fit was not there, right? So think about this and also prepare for behavioral questions and have good answers ready. I want to jump into one of the lower bullet points here first. I'm not saying you should invent anything, right? So making up stories is not the point of this. And in many cases, you will this will be obvious, right? So authenticity is super important. But yeah, in many cases, they are situational. So they will ask questions like, tell me about a time when, and we'll go through a few examples on the next slides. Preparation, again, is key, and you can prepare without preparing for hundreds of questions by preparing, you know, 3 to 4 stories, I call them, previous experiences from, you know, university, from previous jobs, you know, interesting projects, challenging projects, you know, challenging situations with maybe coworkers, with your manager, these kind of things. And you know, nicely write them down, formulate them, and even practice telling them, right? So recently somebody asked me about, you know, duration, how long should it take to tell such a story? It's hard to tell, but you should be able to talk a few minutes, you know, 3 to 5 minutes at least about such a story. And let me mention one thing first before I switch to the next slide. Once you have those 3-4 stories, you can adjust the focus based on the question you get, right? So in many cases, you will face questions about, let's say, how you deliver the project, or how you dealt with conflicts in a project, you know, or, you know, different interests. You can take that same story, you can, in one case, talk more about the technical challenges and the delivery challenges and how, you know, how difficult it was to deliver. In another situation, you can take the same story and you can talk about what personal challenges you faced, you know, and how you resolved that problem, you know, with a coworker or with, you know, the project manager. But what you should do again is situation, action, result, right? So you write down the story before you go ahead and tell it in your preparation. So literally have a situation, an action, and a result section there. And you think about the situation, you think about the context that the interviewer will not have, right? So you give them the right amount of context, some detail, but not too much. And what you want to explain is the challenging part. So what makes the situation challenging? Then the action you took, what you did. And it's important to call out what you did, not only what your team did. So don't be shy to say that as well. And then the results. And again, the results should be measurable, a latency reduction, an operations load reduction, maybe a new feature that attracted many new customers, or it solves a certain customer pain point. So these are the kind of things that you should have in the results section. Examples, classical one, tell me about a time when you disagreed with your manager, you felt you didn't have enough information to make a good decision. So this is about risk, for example. The more general ones, tell me about a time when you designed the web service or a web app, or maybe where you took the lead on designing something and working on a feature or an application. So then it comes to leadership, being a tech lead, coordinating, reviewing things. And one that I quite like is tell me about a time where you wrote documentation. So things like, okay, first of all, do you write documentation? How do you go about it? How do you feel about it? Things like this, right? There are many, many more, but most of them fall into a few buckets, right? And yeah, that's that. Let's have a few more talking points here about behavioral questions in depth. So we know you'll be prepared, you'll have a few stories. There is a few categories of questions you can face. The way you can categorize them is by understanding the intent, right? So the intent of the question is, what is this person, what is the interviewer probing you for? So disagreement with somebody, it's about conflict management, right? How you navigate through conflicts. Another one, when it comes to documentation, maybe it comes to testing, it's about your sense of quality, right? How you influence your team software by writing good documentation and writing strong tests, for example. It depends always on the role you're applying for and the seniority. So in many cases, let's talk about this conflict problem again. If that question goes to a senior engineer, maybe even an engineering manager, the expectations are going to be very different from asking the same question to a junior developer. Let's talk about a senior SDE or a senior developer question. In many cases, that would be, tell me about a time where you influenced other teams or where you influenced architectural decisions. So this is then aimed at how well is this person in, how broad is the scope of this person? What was the previous experience, the previous scope of the role this person was in? You want to understand if that engineer, if that senior engineer is an architect, in another word, right? So it depends on the role, it depends on your seniority, and it depends on the company as well. So assume you have a big enterprise, a big company, and they may want to hear that you're familiar with certain processes of designing and writing documentation, implementing agile, and then going through a QA cycle, versus a startup that has to move very fast, and that company will probably want to hear about your ability to go to market very fast, come up with a scrappy solution and put it into production, so to say. So have this in mind when you think about the behavioral questions. And yeah, I mentioned this before, tailor the answer to the situation. So you pick one of those stories and you focus on one aspect more than another, depending on the question. Last slide. So the offer stage. This is something that depends very much from company to company. All I want to say to this part is, let's say you were successful, they want to give you an offer. Don't shy away from negotiating the offer and negotiating, maybe the terms. I'm not saying you can always get more than it's in there, but maybe you want to just change some of the terms of the offer. And mostly companies are open to discuss it. And if it's the right company for you, if it's the right place for you to grow, I would also focus on that, not only on the monetary aspects. Cool. Let's go into Q&A mode. So let me just make that window bigger here. So you guys have a question section. I'm going to read those questions there, and I'll answer them. So now is the time to put questions there. I see 3 questions right now. So let's see. What may be the possible reason when an interview went well, but you didn't get selected for the job? Many reasons. Many reasons. In many cases, it's just that you think it went well, but you raised some red flags. But also in some cases, it doesn't have anything to do with you or the interview. It can just happen that for the same position, 10 other great candidates applied for, and they just filled it before you were able to interview, or maybe you were the last one. It can have so many stupid organizational reasons that they have nothing to do with your performance. And this is actually important, right? So if you fail in an interview, always learn from it. In every interview, nothing is perfect. No interview loop is perfect. Try to take away as much as you can, technically and personally. And if you fail, don't take it as I'm not good enough for this. I'm not a good enough engineer for this. Just take the learnings and move on, because big companies are big and small companies are just companies, right? They're not there to so to say pick the best people or pick the best engineer. There's always a certain element of randomness to it. Okay, so the second question here. I'm doing masters in CS first year. What would be the right time for applying internships, specifically at Silicon Valley? The right time, this is hard to tell for me, because I don't know your university and your curriculum and how fast you move, how much practical knowledge they'll give you, and how much theoretical knowledge they cover in the first year. The interns that I've worked with, they were usually into their university for, I'd say, 2 to 3 years. So they have some experience. And I think it actually makes more sense if you bring more experience, because only then you have some of the tools that you need, some of the skills that you need to make a real change and to be very productive, to be really productive. You don't want to be just watching, so to say. You want to do stuff in an internship. How to prepare for system design, tutorials, channels. I think I've answered this question during the slides. Yeah, go to my channel, successintech.com, or on YouTube, and there again I answer more of this. Okay, where can we find some good examples of system design questions? That's an interesting one. I don't have a good answer for that right now. What I would do is I would look at this website, highscalability.com, and get inspired by that. Get inspired in the sense of, how do big companies solve their scaling problems, and look, take that lead and look for more information. Take a few of those technologies, a few of the concepts that you read about there, and just do some more research. And yeah, again, go to my YouTube channel. You'll find a few interview questions, a number of interview questions in system design there, and and I think I've put a few resources there as well. So what else? What questions should we ask the interviewer after the interview? This is a good one. In many cases, this feels like you have to ask something smart, and you can't just leave, so to say. I agree, you should ask something, but it should not feel like an obligation. This is the time where you can try to find out things, not only about the company, not only about the things that HR tells you and the nice websites and advertisements they have. It's actually the time where you can get to know the people working there. And especially if this is an interview loop where you are interviewing with people from that team that you will be working at. Especially in that case, you want to, or I would at least ask about the team culture, how the team works together, how they do their sprint planning, maybe how they have maybe even social events, if they have any retrospectives, for example, how they work with the product managers, how they plan projects, how, for example, how their initiatives or their ideas are incorporated into their roadmaps. These kind of things you want to know, because again, it's going to be your environment for a while, if you go to that team. So I would focus on those questions, authentic questions, honest questions. Usually you can save yourself the corporate, blah blah. You're not really interested in it anyways, right? So get to know the team, get to know the people, and take away some information from that interview as well. Should I mention that I have been laid off unless asked specifically? It's an interesting question. No, I don't think you need to mention that you have been laid off. If you're asked about it, you can tell them, but why should you tell them if you're not asked, right? In many cases, even if I'm not laid off, I don't go to an interview and say, hey, I've been here because I was bored at my previous company. If it comes up in the discussion, why not? But it's not something you have to, put there proactively. Yeah, so this is a question that is interesting. I have gone through the full round of interviews at a few companies just to be told that there's a hiring freeze. Why does HR or engineering go through the full process if the slot isn't even available? This is exactly the kind of randomness that you will get with many companies out there. As I said, all of them are just humans and they're big organizations. So sometimes those processes just break down, They come up with a plan to hire a certain number of people. They start interviewing, they hire a lot of them, maybe for this location, that location, and then a review happens and they realize, oh, we hired too many people, maybe, right? So I don't know the exact reasons in your case, of course, but these are the things that do happen from time to time. And it's frustrating, I totally understand that. But there are two upsides. First of all, if you went through the whole loop and the loop was positive, in many cases they will reach out to you later on, maybe 6 months down the line, and they will just make you an offer, or they maybe bring you in for one more interview and then they make you an offer. So they probably don't put you through the same loop again, right? So that's a big advantage. And then the other advantage, if the first one is not there, at least you went through the whole loop and you gathered a ton of experience, right? You went through a on-site loop, and that by itself is so valuable, because nothing replaces real experience. Lots of questions here. We won't be able to answer all of them. What steps would you take if there is a coding challenge you find difficult to solve? What I did in the past was I would put a timer and work on a coding interview question or coding challenge, for at least, let's say, 20 minutes or something, without trying to look up solutions. Okay, so this is number one. You really want to try hard without, right away going to Google and Google for the solutions. A little helper that I was using sometimes is when you don't know how to approach it, you're just, blackout situation, so to say. Think of all the data structures Think of, okay, can I use a linked list here? Can I use a hash map here? So these kind of approach, and think of the data structure and the benefits this data structure has, and if it makes sense to apply it in the situation. Can I use a binary tree here? Can I use a Bloom filter here? Some of the more exotic data structures. Sometimes those properties of the data structures, they fit perfectly on the interview, and it's just one way of approaching it. Another way that many people recommend, and this not always works, is to come up with a very brute force naive solution, right? Because at least you have something. Then you want to have some solution to it, and it helps. Maybe you can then optimize the solution and you find a better one. Okay, last question. Okay, let's say second to last question. Your YouTube channel name, please. YouTube channel name, it says down here, Success in Tech. You'll find successintech.com. That's the website. You'll find YouTube, the link to YouTube there. So let's pick a last one. Do I need to study system design if I don't have a computer science background but know how to code? Yes, especially then I think you need to study system design. You can code, yes, but coding itself, doesn't explain why you are making certain architectural decisions, right? So think about systems, bigger than just, a little backend service and an app or something like this. Think about bigger systems, try to research them, read a few of those books that I mentioned in these presentations, because those are books that people, are recommended in university while they go through a classic computer science education. And I'm not saying you need that, but I'm saying that you should pick a few of those resources and fundamentals and get to know them. Cool. That is it. Thank you everybody for joining. I hope this was helpful. And yeah, use HackerEarth. Thank you for hosting me. It was a lot of fun. Thanks.